My wife agreed so quickly that I actually laughed. Not because it was funny. Because for a split second I thought she was joking. Sure, she said without even looking up from her coffee. If that's what you want. That sentence has been echoing in my head for almost 2 years now. If you'd asked me before that morning, I would have described our marriage as comfortably predictable. Not perfect. We argued over bills, forgot anniversaries, rolled our eyes at each other's habits. Normal stuff. We had been together long enough to stop pretending we were exciting and start appreciating being safe. The weird thing is that my wife was never someone who accepted change easily. She cried when we sold our first apartment. She refused to replace her old car because it reminded her of our first road trip. She once spent 3 days upset because our favorite diner closed. Yet when I suggested something that should have shattered her completely, she didn't hesitate. No questions. No tears. No negotiation. Just, okay. I thought I had married the woman who fought for us. I didn't realize she had already stopped fighting long before I noticed. At first, I convinced myself I was overthinking it. People change. Marriage changes. Maybe she was just tired of arguing. Maybe we had finally reached that stage where compromise came easier than conflict. I wanted to believe that because the alternative was terrifying. Still, something about her calmness felt rehearsed. A year earlier, I had casually mentioned the possibility of moving to another city if I ever got promoted. She immediately shut the conversation down. She said she could never leave our home, our friends, the neighborhood where we'd built our life together. We spent hours debating it, and she cried before we finally dropped the subject. Now, when I suggested something even bigger, something that would completely redefine our future, she barely looked at me. Whatever makes you happy, she said. Not us. Me. That tiny difference should have hit me harder. Instead, I thanked her, kissed her forehead, and went to work believing I was lucky to have such an understanding partner. Looking back, I think that was the exact moment my marriage quietly ended. I just didn't know it yet. The change wasn't dramatic enough for anyone else to notice. She still asked if I'd eaten lunch. She still folded my shirts the way I liked. She still texted me to drive safely when it rained. From the outside, we looked exactly like the couple we'd always been. But all the little things that made us started disappearing. She stopped telling me random stories about her day. She no longer reached for my hand during movies. When I came home from work, she smiled politely instead of lighting up the way she used to. I blamed stress. Her job had become demanding, and my hours were getting longer. It was easy to tell myself we were simply exhausted. Friends even commented on how mature our relationship seemed. No unnecessary drama, one of them joked. I smiled because I wanted to believe that was true. The first real warning came one evening when I hugged her from behind while she was washing dishes. She flinched. Not dramatically. Just enough to make me loosen my arms. She apologized immediately and said, "Sorry, you startled me." I accepted the explanation. Now I wonder if someone else had already become the person she expected to touch her. A few weeks later, something happened that should have bothered me a lot more than it did. We were having dinner with my sister and her husband when the conversation turned to relationships. Someone joked about how couples eventually know everything about each other. My wife smiled, but it looked forced. "You never really know another person," she said quietly. The table went silent for a second. My sister laughed awkwardly and changed the subject, but I couldn't stop thinking about those words. On the drive home, I asked her what she meant. She shrugged without looking at me. Nothing. Just one of those thoughts. Normally she loved long conversations in the car. We'd dissect movies, gossip about coworkers, dream about vacations we couldn't afford. That night, every answer was short, almost mechanical. When we got home, she went straight to bed, saying she had a headache. I stayed in the living room watching television without actually seeing it. For the first time, I felt like I was sharing a house with someone who was carefully choosing which parts of herself I was still allowed to see. That feeling refused to leave me. The suspicion didn't begin with lipstick on a collar or a mysterious hotel receipt. It started with a notification. She had left her phone on the kitchen counter while taking a shower. I wasn't the kind of husband who checked her messages. We had always trusted each other, and I never wanted to become the jealous, paranoid spouse I'd seen in so many stories online. Then her screen lit up. The preview showed only a few words. "Are you going to tell him?" No name. Just the message. I froze. For several seconds, I simply stared at the phone, waiting for another notification that never came. When she walked back into the kitchen with wet hair wrapped in a towel, she noticed me standing there. Our eyes met. She looked at the phone. Then back at me. For the first time in our entire marriage, I watched genuine panic spread across her face. "What is that?" I asked as calmly as I could. She grabbed the phone so quickly it almost slipped from her hand. "It's nothing." The words came too fast. Too rehearsed. And deep inside, something I'd been refusing to acknowledge finally cracked. I didn't yell. That surprised both of us. I simply asked, "Who wants you to tell me something?" She kept staring at the floor instead of answering. "It was a coworker," she finally said. "She's dealing with her husband, and she was asking for advice." It sounded possible. Maybe even believable. But she had always been terrible at lying. Whenever she wasn't telling the truth, she'd over-explain every tiny detail. This time, she gave me almost nothing. "What's her name?" I asked. A pause. Then another. "I'd rather not involve her. That wasn't my wife." She was the kind of person who volunteered information before anyone even asked. Suddenly she was protecting someone I'd never heard of. I nodded and let the conversation end, but sleep never came that night. She lay beside me pretending to breathe evenly. I pretended to believe her. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, I realized we were both awake, both staring into the darkness, both waiting for the other person to say something. Neither of us did. Silence settled between us like a third person in the bed, and I knew it wasn't leaving anytime soon. The truth started leaking out in pieces instead of arriving all at once. Over the next week, I noticed little things that suddenly seemed impossible to ignore. She began taking calls outside. Her phone, which had always been left face up on the table, was now locked and tucked into her pocket. She smiled at messages she never shared with me. Every time I asked if everything was okay, she answered with the same tired smile. "I'm just stressed." I wanted to believe her so badly that I almost succeeded. Then Saturday came. She was grocery shopping while I stayed home to fix a cabinet in the kitchen. Halfway through, I realized I needed a measurement that I'd saved in the Notes app on our shared tablet. When I opened it, the note wasn't there. Instead, the messaging app was still logged in. I wasn't looking for secrets. But there they were. The latest conversation sat at the top of the screen. One sentence caught my eye before I could stop myself. "He actually thinks we're going to make it through this." My hands went numb. I kept reading, even though part of me already knew I would never be the same again. I wish I could say the messages were ambiguous. They weren't. There was no flirting hidden between innocent conversations. No room for misunderstanding. They talked about weekends they'd spent together while I was supposedly working late. They joked about how easily I'd accepted every explanation she gave me. Then I found the message that explained everything. When he asked about opening the marriage, I couldn't believe it. A year ago I would have fallen apart. This time I just said yes. I already knew I was leaving emotionally. I stopped breathing for a moment. That was it. The conversation we'd had months earlier. The one that had haunted me ever since because she'd agreed so quickly. I had thought her calm acceptance meant she trusted me. In reality, it meant she no longer cared enough to fight. Another message appeared below. "I almost feel guilty." Almost. I closed the tablet before I could read another word. Not because I'd seen enough. Because I knew that if I kept going, I'd lose every good memory we'd ever made together. Some betrayals don't erase the past. They poison it until nothing feels real anymore. She came home carrying grocery bags and smiling like it was any other Saturday. For a second, I almost admired how normal she looked. I helped her unload the bags without saying a word. We put food into the refrigerator, stacked cans in the pantry, and placed fresh bread on the counter. Then I slid the tablet across the kitchen island. I know. She didn't ask what I meant. She looked at the screen, closed her eyes, and whispered, "How much did you read?" "Enough." The silence that followed felt endless. Finally, she pulled out a chair and sat down as if her legs had given up. "I never wanted you to find out like this." I laughed. It wasn't amusement. It was disbelief. So there was a better way? Tears filled her eyes almost instantly. "I was trying to figure out how to tell you." "Tell me what?" I snapped. "That you stopped loving me? That you've been lying for months? Or that everyone except me already knew?" She buried her face in her hands. The answer came out so quietly I barely heard it. "I didn't stop loving you." That somehow hurt even more. I asked the question I had been dreading since I read those messages. "Who is he?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she wiped her face, took a shaky breath, and whispered his name. "It was someone I knew." Not a close friend, but close enough that he'd been in our house more than once. We'd shared barbecues, celebrated birthdays, laughed over stupid stories. I had trusted him without ever thinking twice. I actually looked toward the front door, half expecting him to walk in and tell me this was some elaborate misunderstanding. "He didn't plan this," she said quickly. "Neither of us did." I stared at her. "You expect me to believe that?" "It just happened." Those 3 words made something inside me snap. "No," I said. "People don't accidentally lie every day. They don't accidentally delete messages. They don't accidentally build another relationship while pretending their marriage is fine." She started crying harder. "I know how it looks. It looks exactly like what it is." For the first time in years, neither of us had anything left to hide. The truth was finally sitting between us. The conversation lasted almost 6 hours. Every answer created 3 new questions. She admitted the affair had started as emotional long before it became physical. They worked on the same project, spent late evenings together, and slowly crossed lines she insisted she'd never intended to cross. "I kept telling myself I'd end it," she said through tears. "So why didn't you?" She looked exhausted. "Because every time I came home, I felt guilty. And guilt made me avoid you. The more I avoided you, the closer I became to him." It sounded twisted, but I could see how she'd trapped herself. Then she confessed something that hit me even harder. "When you suggested opening the marriage," she whispered, "I realized you'd already sensed something was wrong. I thought maybe if I agreed, I wouldn't have to choose immediately. I couldn't even process that. So my idea wasn't permission." She shook her head. "It was an escape. For both of us." I'd spent months believing her quick agreement was proof she'd changed. Instead, it was proof she'd already given up on saving what we had, even if she couldn't admit it aloud. The days that followed blurred together. We still lived in the same house, but it no longer felt like home. We slept in separate rooms, spoke only when necessary, and moved around each other like strangers sharing a hotel. Neither of us told our families at first. It felt impossible to explain something I barely understood myself. Then my sister stopped by unexpectedly. She took one look at us and asked, "What happened?" I tried to lie. My wife couldn't. She broke down crying before either of us finished a sentence. Within a week, everyone knew. Some people blamed her without hesitation. Others quietly asked what I'd done to push her away. That question made me furious. As if betrayal always needed a reason. As if being cheated on meant I'd failed some invisible test as a husband. My parents wanted me to file for divorce immediately. Her mother begged me to give her another chance. Everyone had an opinion. The only people who actually had to live with the consequences were the two of us. By then, every room in our house carried memories that felt impossible to escape. I tried therapy because I honestly didn't know what else to do. Not couples counseling at first. Just me. I kept asking the same question every session. How do I stop replaying everything? The vacations. The birthdays. The quiet evenings on the couch. Every memory had become contaminated by the possibility that she was already pulling away while I believed we were happy. My therapist said something that stayed with me. You aren't grieving only your marriage. You're grieving the version of your life you thought was true. That hurt because it felt painfully accurate. Meanwhile, my wife ended the affair. At least, that's what she told me. For the first time in months, I actually believed her. The strange part was that it no longer mattered. The affair wasn't the only thing standing between us anymore. Trust had disappeared so completely that even honest words sounded like lies. She cried often. I rarely did. Instead, I felt numb, like my emotions had shut down to protect me from carrying any more pain. I missed the life I'd believed I had more than the one I was actually living. About 8 months after everything came out, we signed the divorce papers. There wasn't a dramatic courtroom scene or one final screaming match. Just two exhausted people sitting across from each other, signing documents that officially ended a life we'd spent years building. When we walked outside, she asked if we could talk one last time. I almost said no. Instead, we sat on a bench across the street in complete silence for several minutes. Finally, she whispered, I'm sorry that I became someone who could hurt you like this. It was the most honest thing she'd said since all of this began. I believe you're sorry, I answered. She looked up, surprised. But being sorry doesn't rebuild trust. She nodded slowly, tears filling her eyes again. I know. That was the strange part. For months I'd wanted an apology. When I finally received one, it didn't change anything. Love had survived longer than trust. And without trust, love felt more like a painful memory than something capable of keeping two people together. We hugged goodbye. Neither of us asked if we'd ever meet again. It's been almost 2 years now, and people still ask why our marriage ended. Most of the time, I give the easy answer. We grew apart. Technically, it's true. It just leaves out the slow collapse, the lies, the messages, and the moment I realized my wife had emotionally left our marriage long before either of us admitted it. Sometimes I still think about that morning when I suggested opening the marriage. Back then, I believed her immediate agreement meant she'd become more understanding. Now I know it meant something far sadder. She wasn't protecting our relationship. She was protecting the secret life she'd already started living. I don't hate her anymore. Hate requires energy, and I spent all of mine trying to understand what happened. What I feel now is quieter. It's grief for the future we planned and for the version of us that never actually got the chance to survive. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Pay attention when someone stops fighting for something they once would have defended with everything they had. Sometimes indifference is the loudest confession you'll ever hear.